Hello, and welcome to another chapter of revision strategies. In this one, we are going to be focusing on how to work with your sources. Because when we're dealing with academic writing and including sources, it can get a little hairy sometimes. So let's start looking at different ways to be very successful at getting sources into our papers. First, we need to figure out what is in my source, whether it be a book, an article, a scientific study, a write-up, a documentary, whatever it may be. And we're going to try to figure out what do we need to take from that and put into our essay. Specific data, statistics, or case evidence is usually a really good thing to put into your paper because this kind of very logical information can help support a lot of what you're saying or show the depth or breadth of a situation. And this is usually not something that is general knowledge. Some specific data may be more general knowledge, such as the overall population of the United States. That's kind of general knowledge. But if you're trying to talk about the approximate amount of the population that is a certain minority group, that most likely is not common knowledge, and you're going to need a source for that. Source information that also confirms a claim that you've made in one of your paragraphs is really important because you don't want to just stand on a point alone. If you believe that this policy discriminates against a certain group, then having another source that's credible that backs you up on that is really important because then it's not just you saying this, it's you and another expert. Source information could also support another source. So if you have one source that maybe gives you sort of a general overview of a problem or a topic, but you have another source that goes more in depth into the details of that, sometimes one source can support another. Another way that this can happen is if you have two credible sources saying the same thing. So if you have two separate independent scientific studies that both come to the same conclusion, citing both of them will help strengthen both of them because then it's an experiment that's been repeated successfully with the same results. One very important thing to look at when we're taking information from sources is that it's contextually accurate. And what this means is not only has the source made a claim or a conclusion that is accurate based on the context of the situation. So it's looking at the big picture. It's not just looking at a tiny piece of the puzzle, but also that you are using this in a contextually accurate way. An example of how this could go wrong is, say, that you are writing a paper about protecting the bald eagles, and you're looking at destruction of their habitats. And you find a source that talks about destruction of bird habitats, but they're looking more about like the Canadian geese habitats. So by you using some of that information from the source, I mean, yeah, you might get some general things that would apply from Canadian geese to bald eagles, but you're taking that information about the Canadian geese's habitat out of context and using it for your paper on bald eagles. And this actually does happen quite a bit. More than we would necessarily think it does, because we see a sentence that seems to support what we're saying, but we forget that that sentence is part of a paragraph, which is part of a larger piece. And if we don't look at the entire context of the essay or article or whatever it is, and the entire context of the paragraph, we might be changing the meaning of that sentence by taking it out. We can see this also in how we've all had those experiences where you hear somebody say something, and because you weren't listening to the conversation, you completely misunderstood what that person said because you took it out of context. There's even games where you can play that a sentence that sounds absolutely wrong in one context would make absolute sense in another context. So context is incredibly important when we're looking at what we're taking from sources, and then how we're using it within our papers. Things that we want to avoid taking from sources is general statements. These are things that we can pretty much say on our own. We don't need to quote things that are really kind of common sense or are introductory information, because you can create your own. You also don't want to have sources that are just parroting what you have just said, okay? If you're going to have your source say it, then you can transition into it, but we already know that you agree with this or that you believe this because you're the one who's putting it in your paper. You don't have to say, I believe bald eagles should be protected, and then quote a source that says bald eagles should be protected. We know that by you using this quote that you agree with whatever they're saying. Does that make sense? Always let me know if you have questions about things like these. All right, so I got my sources. I know what information I'm going to take from them. Now what do I do? Well, the next decision that you're going to have to make is whether you are going to quote, paraphrase, or summarize. Quoting is when you're using the exact words that the author uses and quotation marks around those words, okay? This is when you cannot say it any better than the source. Maybe their word choice is absolutely essential to making your point, or it's really complicated statistics, data, numbers, dates, issues. It's just going to be really, 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 really difficult for you to paraphrase this. So those are cases in which it is good to quote. We also want to make this on the shorter side. Block quotes and long quotes sometimes are useful and helpful, but most of the time they can be paraphrased or summarized much better, and it doesn't break the flow of your essay nearly as much. Paraphrasing is the choice that we're going to make when you can say it better or just as well as the author, but using their ideas and your words. All right, these are usually short sections of the original work, but they don't have to be like one sentence followed by another sentence followed by another sentence. You might pick 3 sentences out of one paragraph that may not be right next to each other to paraphrase, because they may be doing transitions or references to a specific thing that doesn't quite apply to your paper. So you can do paraphrasing of things that aren't linearly aligned. The big problem that happens a lot with paraphrasing is patchwork plagiarism, because when you're trying to take their ideas and put it into your words, how do we do that can get a little tricky. And we're going to talk a lot more about patchwork plagiarism in just a few minutes. So when paraphrasing is their ideas, your words, but short chunks, summarizing is when we're doing much bigger chunks. So we are going to be giving overall ideas from an entire work, an entire article, or an entire paragraph even. And it's condensing a lot of the original information into a much smaller bite suitable for your purposes and audiences. You might be summarizing the entire point of an article into less than a full sentence. And that is okay, because you're going to be just giving this overall impression that came from somebody else, or this confirmation of a claim that you made that came from somebody else, into your essay. These are still going to be their ideas, but you're going to be using your words. Again, patchwork plagiarism can happen quite a bit with summarizing. It's a little bit more common with paraphrasing, but it can happen with summarizing. So when we are doing our incorporation of sources, tiny little things are going to make a very, very huge difference. And basically, it's about punctuation. So in this first example, we have the need for the bald eagle's population to remain stable is clear. Because of how that is structured, there's no source, there's no quotation marks. This means that this is the student's idea and the student's words, and no sources were used. If you did use a source here and it was written just like this, that is technically plagiarism. Okay? Now here in the second one, we have just added an in-text citation at the end of the sentence. So what this signals to the reader is that the information is now summarized or paraphrased from this author, Morgenstern. So it's the source's ideas, but your words. It is not a direct quote. So if we went into that Morgenstern paper for this second example here, we would find the idea that we really need to support the bald eagle's population and keep it at a good, stable level. But we wouldn't find this exact sentence in their paper. Okay? Now, if that exact sentence is in Morgenstern's essay or article, then we have to put in quotation marks. And this means that these are the exact words that the source used. Okay? So even by just forgetting the quotation marks for a quote, you could be indicating that you have paraphrased when you haven't, and that is plagiarism. Okay? Because plagiarism means we don't steal. We don't say something is ours when it's not. And so if you forget those quotation marks, you're saying, these are my words, but they're ideas. And if this was a direct quote, that's not true. Okay? So when you use a direct quote and you copy and paste, you have to have quotation marks or it is plagiarism. If you are paraphrasing and using different words, you have to have that in-text citation or it is plagiarism. All right? So now with patchwork plagiarism, let's review this really quickly because this can come into effect when we start incorporating sources into our essay. Patchwork plagiarism is when not enough is changed to make the paraphrased sentence different from the original source. Just changing a few words is not enough. Using the same kind of sentence structure is a big danger sign because that's going to make it much more likely that you will accidentally plagiarize. A lot of times you will see phrases like this is too close or it borrows too heavily from the original source. And those are phrases that a lot of teachers use when they're referring to patchwork plagiarism. So when you're learning to paraphrase, it's really hard to know sometimes when it's changed enough to make it your words. So to be safe, first of all, change the whole sentence structure. Okay? Don't go copying, like if they start off with an adjective clause and then move in to an independent clause, like try not to copy that. Some terms or noun phrases aren't going to be able to be changed, especially proper nouns like the United States of America. Like we can't paraphrase that. But most everything else can. And when we are trying to change it into our words, one technique a lot of people tend to do is thesaurus editing, where they just like right click on each of the major words and just choose a different word. First of all, that's not changing the sentence structure. It's not putting everything into your own words, so it's still going to be patchwork plagiarism. Secondly, this can get you into a lot of trouble, actually, because while a lot of words that are in the thesaurus do have similar enough meanings that you can replace someone for another, that is not true of all words in the English language. Just because it's in the thesaurus does not mean it's going to mean the exact same thing in the same context as that sentence. You can completely change the meaning of the sentence by picking the wrong adjective or adverb or noun. Okay? For example, house, hovel, hut, apartment. These are all synonyms for home. But they mean very, very different things. Saying that you live in an apartment versus a hovel brings up a very different image, okay? So you have to be very careful about this. Another tip for avoiding patchwork plagiarism when you're paraphrasing is to read your source, know what you want, the ideas that you want to get across, then put the source away. Don't look at it, and then just try to think, how would I explain this to somebody else? And that can sometimes help you put it into your own words, especially if you don't have the exact words right in front of you. And sometimes having like a little bit of time between when you read the source and when you're writing about it can also help you construct a new sentence that is in your own words. So here are some examples of patchwork plagiarism. in this case, we had the student looking at the original source and they deleted some of the words and it changed a couple of the words. So instead of wrap, they found a synonym, bind. And this one actually works as far as meaning. It keeps the meaning, wrap and bind do work. But as you can see, the vast majority of the sentence is still there. You can't just delete a few words or move a few words or replace a few words and call it your own. All right? This is patchwork plagiarism. How can we do it a little bit better? All right? First of all, we're going to change the sentence structure, and then we're also going to look at what is the main idea that they're trying to get across here. Okay? The main idea is not that we have to have a built-in security blanket or a big fuzzy tail. The main point is the squirrel is able to survive the winter because it's keeping warm because it's using its tail as a blanket. So how can I use that in my own words? And in the student's example, they have all the details here. We're talking about wintertime. So in winter, squirrels have great techniques to keep themselves from freezing in the cold temperatures. Their iconic bushy tail works perfectly as a furry blanket. So we do have some different adjectives that we changed out. So instead of a fuzzy tail, we have a furry tail. And it's bushy is another synonym that we put in there. But we kept the main idea while avoiding the same sentence structure and avoiding using a lot of the same words. Here's another example of using the same sentence structure. And you can see how they changed a lot more, but because they used the same sentence structure, it kind of set them up for failure because they're still using chunks. And we see that they just changed a few words. So in reality, in truth, all bats can see, every bat can see. I mean, it's just too close. So how could we do this a little bit better? We get the main idea, all right? So the main idea from this original source is, yeah, we all think bats are blind, but they're not. They can see, and it doesn't matter how much light there is. They can still see. So let's talk about that. Despite popular opinion, all members of the bat family do have good vision, regardless of how much light is available. All right, I just took 3 sentences and turned it into one complex sentence. And I got the same ideas. Using vision instead of see really helped because they were using that same verb over and over and over again. And by avoiding that verb, it helped me avoid patchwork plagiarism. Okay. Another issue with plagiarism, now that we've set aside accidentally with patchwork plagiarism, is the difference between attribution and citation. And this is a really, really, really easy thing to get messed up because we think, oh, we gave credit to the author, therefore it's cited. No, because citations are very, very specific. Citations are giving information about the source inside parentheses at the end of the quoted, paraphrased, or summarized material. A citation is inside parentheses. Always. That is what a citation is. Citations are mandatory in order to say that you have not plagiarized. Okay? Attribution, on the other hand, is optional, is not in parentheses, and it gives some information about the author, title, or source in the written sentence. Okay? So attribution does give credit to the author, but it is not a citation. And plagiarism is determined by whether or not you have citations, not whether you have quote-unquote given credit. Okay? I know this is really nuanced and it seems really nitpicky, but there are reasons for this. And part of that is because some of the stuff that we might use in attribution wouldn't necessarily be in the citation for source, like that full reference citation so that I can find it. So I may not be able to clearly track which source you actually got this information from, especially if the source that you're using talks about what other people have researched, and it gets really, really complicated. So that is why they've made this rule that citations are mandatory, they have to be in parentheses, and you have to have them period end. Okay? So when we are getting ready to write our paragraphs for our essay and we are going to be incorporating source information, there are 4 things we need to keep in mind. First is location. Where am I going to stick the sourced information? Sometimes it's going to work really well at the very beginning because it'll help get attention, especially if it's like a startling statistic or a very heart-rending emotional story or case study. A lot of times that will happen at the beginning of an introduction, for example. If you are using the source information not so much to get attention, but more to support a claim that you've made or a subclaim, like a detail that is, proving your claim true, then it's going to be further down in the paragraph, okay? When are we going to be using attribution? We're going to go a little bit more into detail in the next few slides about this, but overall, attribution is really useful when we need more credibility. Maybe we're making a claim that is a little bit hard to believe or it's very controversial, and it would be really helpful for us to let our audience know that, hey, there are really smart experts out there who do agree with me. And so giving attribution and saying, so-and-so who are credible because of X, Y, and Z also say this, then that's going to be adding very specific credibility. Attribution can also help with clarity when you're using several sources. And again, we will see that in a little bit. Citations have to be used immediately. As soon as you're done with putting in your quote, your paraphrase, or your summary, as soon as you hit that last word, put in the parentheses, put in the citation. If we end up with too many citations, we can always take them out later, but it's always, 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 always better to have too many than not enough. Too many will be an MLA error and might cost you a few points. Not having enough can get you a 0 for plagiarism. Attribution can also change what is going to be inside your citations, and we will be also talking about that in just a few minutes. The 4th thing that we need to be mindful of when sticking in information from sources is this idea of drive-by quotes, which is when you are reading something and then there is just like a quote. It's almost always a quote, but it could be a paraphrase or a summary that it just seems stuck in there for no real good reason. It's just like it's there and then it's gone, and you're like, what? What did I just read? How does that make sense? Why does that fit here? And it's kind of like a drive-by. It came in and it went out, and we don't really understand the context of why you're using this information here. It just doesn't make sense. And so we want to make sure that every time that we are using information from another source, that it has a specific purpose and that we've set it up in our paragraph, maybe through transitions, maybe through an introductory sentence, maybe through a comparative structure to show why we are including this information. All right, so attribution can change your citations. And this is the quick and easy, dirty MLA chart for what can happen and how you would change your citation. So if you choose to use attribution and you use the author's names, so according to Smith, Lee, and Jones, your citation then, what's in the parentheses, is going to be the title. If you use the author's credentials, like 5 leading experts from Harvard claim that, blah, 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 then you would write their name or names in the citation in parentheses. If you're using the authors and the title in your attribution, so Smith, Lee's, and Jones' book, The Wonderful World of Bats and Caves, all right, if you use both of those in your sentence, then your citation at the end is going to be the publication. So if that was published as a book, and then you would put the publisher's name there. If it was a website, then you would put the website's name there. So New York Times or Google Books, whatever. If you're using the publication, this can be really helpful if maybe you weren't able to find really good specific credentials on the authors, or the title isn't super helpful. So you might want to say, like, according to this news source, and it sounds like it's adding credibility because, say, for example, New York Times, pretty well known for being very accurate, or at least trying to be accurate. By using the publication, then we would have the author name or names in the citation. Now, I put a little asterisk here because what if there is no published author? What if we don't know who the exact author is? In this case, if you're using the publication, you would use the title if there is no author, okay? Or what if we're using the title? Like, according to the wonderful world of bats and caves, all right? So that title of the book would give us a pretty good contextual clue about what is in this book. You would, in the citation, use the author names. And again, if we had something that had no published author, in this case, you would use the publication. So it goes author, title, publication, all right? So that is how it would change your citations. A few more notes on attribution, okay? Do vary the ways that you write attribution. Please don't say according to, according to, according to, according to, or so-and-so says, so-and-so says, so-and-so says. This is boring for the reader. And there are so many different ways that you can do this. Do you have to do it at the beginning of the sentence? No, you can do it at the end of the sentence, okay? If you are really struggling with trying to figure out different ways to do this, look at the They Say, I Say resource that we have for our class. They give you several different templates that will work depending on exactly what you're doing. So if you are just introducing the author, they give you several different options. If you are quoting something that the author says, they'll give you several verb options that you can choose from as well. Do give contextual information on the authors, all right? Unless the authors are super well known, like former President Barack Obama. Okay, we know that name. We know who he is. We know what he's probably credible about and what he's not. All right, so that's one that we probably would not have to give contextual information for. But what if you say Smithley and Jones? Smithley and Jones who? Like, that could be hundreds, if not thousands of different people. So they're not immediately recognizable names. So sometimes giving some sort of contextual information can help us understand why this is adding to your credibility. So Smithley and Jones from York University. Oh, so they're teachers or researchers. Okay, all right. And York University has a good reputation, so there we go. They got credibility. And now we know something about these authors and why you're using them. Okay, maybe the authors are all highly experienced in the field of pharmacology, or maybe they are all veterans from the Gulf War, or they all have something in common, some sort of experience, some sort of training, some sort of education, some sort of work that they've done. That kind of contextual information is really helpful for establishing credibility. You do want to also use attribution when you're using multiple sources in a single paragraph, because it can often help us transition between what you're saying and what new information is coming out from a source. Do not use attribution in places of a citation. We've talked about that. That's plagiarism. Don't give too much information. All right, we don't need to give the name and the title every single time. We don't need to give name, title, and publication. Like, just give us what we need for the purpose that you're using it for. So if you are mentioning the names because you want to show credibility, or you're giving the credentials, that's all you need. Don't give tons of extras, because it tends to bog down the sentence, and then people are going to start skipping over those details, and they can often miss important points as well. Name dropping is kind of what we talked about before. It's like listing people's names that do not have any sort of context for them, so we don't know why you're referencing these people. Why are they so important for us to believe you further? okay? And don't repeat with each sentence within a paragraph. So let's say that you are summarizing a bunch of information from Smithley and Jones. And so you have been able to summarize their entire article into 4 sentences. You are not going to have attribution at the very beginning of all 4 of those sentences because they're all together. So you can have attribution at any one point in those 4 sentences. So you can have it at the beginning, you can have it in the middle, you could have it at the end, but we're not going to do it for each of those 4 sentences. Just like we would only have 1 citation at the very end of those 4 sentences. We're not going to have a citation at the end of every single one of those sentences because they're all together in one chunk. Now, if you split them up, then we would have to do things, but a little bit differently. But if they're all together, you don't have to do it for every single sentence. All right, so now that we have talked about this, and it's kind of hard to conceptualize visually, like how does this actually look in a paragraph? Let's see how it could look. So I'm going to show you a paragraph that is incorporating information from different sources. And we're going to show you first how it could be done not so well, and then how it can be integrated a lot better using summary, paraphrase, attribution, citation, quote, and also the student's words, ideas, and transitions. So these are the colors that everything is going to be. So if it's the student's words, it's black, summary is purple, paraphrase is yellow, quote is blue, attribution is green, citation is red. I'm going to be going over these as we go through the paragraph, but if it's helpful for you, you can go ahead and pause right now and write down your little legend, your little color legend, what each of these 6 colors mean on a piece of paper or on a Post-it note so that you can remember what they are as we go to the next slide. Okay, so here is a paragraph that is evaluating the Oceanic Protection Act. So the black here is what the student wrote in their own words, okay? This information is not coming from a source. So their topic sentence is going to be in their own words. It's very unusual that a topic sentence is going to be taken from a source, by the way. So the first travesty of the Oceanic Protection Act is that it hasn't been updated in over 30 years, okay? So we are going to be discussing the problem of when we don't update policies. And then we have quotes. All environmental policies, including those regarding pollution, resource acquisition, ownership and responsibility, and international cooperation, should be reassessed at least every 10 years with the opportunity to add amendments as needed to reflect emerging and urgent current events. Whew, that is a long quote. And while there is some really interesting information and definitely applicable information in that quote, we don't need all of this. Okay? The point is, we're talking about things that haven't been updated. So what's the point in this quote that we need? It's that ending part that says that these things should be reassessed at least every 10 years with the opportunity to add amendments as needed to reflect emerging and urgent current events. That's what's important in this quote, not that other stuff. Okay? Because all those other details, we don't even know if that's going to be helpful for our overall argument, or if it's even going to be applicable to everything that we're putting in here. And this paragraph is not talking about pollution, resource acquisition, ownership and responsibility, and international cooperation. It's talking about updating, okay? And so the part of the quote that talks about updating is that last half. So in this one, we probably have quoted too much. You do not have to quote the complete sentence from your source if it's not needed and it's not going to change it contextually. So this is one we could actually cut, and I'm going to show you how that's done in the next slide. Then we have a citation here, Bell and Young, and so this one is not plagiarized, okay? Because we have quotation marks for the exact quote, and we have a citation. Then we move into the next sentence. Commercial fish farms are excellent alternatives to hunting wild populations into near extinction, as well as protecting species that would get caught in nets and be accidentally killed by the World Fishing Consortium. All right, so we have some problems here right up front. First of all, what the heck does this have to do with being updated? Do you see how we've lost context for this quote? Here is a drive-by quote, all right? We have no idea why this is here because we, as the authors, have not set it up to show why it belongs here, all right? We do have the quoted information in quotation marks, so that is correct. And it says by the World Fishing Consortium, so there's some attribution, but we don't have a citation. There's nothing in parentheses after this quote. This is plagiarized because it has to have a citation in parentheses, okay? We do have credit given to a source, but maybe the source was talking about the World Fishing Consortium and it wasn't actually the World Fishing Consortium that put out this quote. That is why attribution cannot replace citation. Okay, so then we have some more from the student. However, the regulations for fish farms rarely address how these can attract common predators like hungry whales who do not understand the difference between a farm of fish and a school of fish. These farmers have been essentially given the right to drive off, harm, or even kill endangered species who might threaten their livestock. Okay, so this kind of makes sense with the previous quote about commercial fish farms, but it's still not quite making sense as far as the overall paragraph. So somehow this fish farms thing, it has to deal with being updated, but we still don't understand that. The next thing that we have is a quote from a source that is continuing this idea that fish farmers have been given the right to drive off, harm, or even kill endangered species who might threaten their livestock. Because we have the advances in oceanic technology for protecting farms include cybernetic nets, sonar pulses, scent distributors, waste containment, vibrational accelerators, and even optical illusions through light spectrum manipulation. So that kind of fits because, you know, it's talking about protecting farms from, like, whales, apparently. But it still doesn't quite make sense. And there's another problem. This is a direct quote. There are not quotation marks. We do have a citation, another way to close the barn door for farm tilapia, but there's no quotation marks. And no quotation marks means their ideas, my words. It's a paraphrase, but it's not a paraphrase. It's a direct quote. Okay, so this would be another example of plagiarism. All because you forgot quotation marks, all right? So this is why your Turnitin reports are so helpful because they will often pick up on the direct quotes that you used and they'll highlight them for you. And all you have to do is look at the highlight and see if there's quotation marks around the highlight. And if there's not, fix it. All right, so how can we incorporate our sources a little bit better so that we have a really clear idea of what all these sources are doing and how they are interacting with each other and how we can kind of smoothly transition from one to another instead of having a bunch of things shoved together that we kind of have to sort out meaning for, right? Because readers aren't going to like sorting out all your meaning. Now, I know this looks really complicated. There's a lot of colors on the screen. It's not as complicated as it looks, okay? So first, we have the exact same first sentence. The first travesty of the Oceanic Protection Act is that it hasn't been updated in over 30 years. That is still our main idea. That is still our topic sentence. Now, we're going to be looking at this Bale and Young quote. First of all, we're trimming it down to just that important part. And then we are paraphrasing in yellow the idea, okay? So any effective environmental policy needs to be updated, okay? That was the idea that Bale and Young were talking about with that huge list, but it's in our own words now. And then we threw in a attribution that uses author credentials. So any effective environmental policy, according to experts at Lincoln University, now we know who Bale and Young are, and we know that they are experts and that they are at this reputable university. And so now we're going to say, oh, okay, experts do agree that this is needed to be updated every 10 years. Okay. Then we finally get some explanation because the student has eliminated this whole drive-by quote thing and is explaining through their own words and some more paraphrasing from the source why this whole fish farming thing fits underneath the updated part. And that is because the 1985 policy also does not account for the major rise in global fishing trade, particularly the growth of farm fishing in the oceans beginning in the late 1990s. Okay, now we know why you're sticking in farm fishing, because this is a problem that cannot be addressed through this act because the act is so old. Gotcha. These farms concentrate large numbers of fish that are highly marketable across the world for human consumption and are touted as, and then we have this quote, excellent alternatives to hunting wild populations into near extinction, as well as protecting species that would get caught in nets and be accidentally killed by the World Fishing Consortium. And then we have the title of the article here. In this case, the World Fishing Consortium actually was the author. But we can't always tell that because look at our other attribution up here from Lincoln University. Lincoln University isn't the author. Bale and Young are. Okay? So in this case, we paraphrased some of the information from the source talking about farm fishing beginning in the late 1990s and then exactly what farm fishing is. And then we use this direct quote, excellent alternatives to hunting wild populations into near extinction, as well as protecting species that would get caught in nets and be accidentally killed, because that wording is going to be really important for our argument, as you see in their next sentence. However, the regulations for fish farms rarely address how these can attract common predators like hungry whales who do not understand the difference between a farm of fish and a school of fish. All right? So by using their words that this is supposed to protect species that would be accidentally killed, we're like, hey, you're not protecting all species because your regulations aren't protecting them. Okay? It is allowed, if not blatantly encouraged, to protect the investment against common perils, which would include natural predators. And this is also taken from the source Garming and Kelly. Okay, so by incorporating this source and using that direct quote, protect the investment against common perils, that wording is very powerful. It's a little, we could paraphrase it, but because of how we are setting up these whales as something that needs to be protected, and they're not being protected because of this outdated Protection Act, then showing how the fish farms are being protected against common perils. Well, these common perils are like endangered whales. So we have an issue here. We have an ethical problem here. And we explain that in the next sentence. Therefore, these farmers have essentially been given the right to drive off, harm, or even kill endangered species who might threaten their livestock. These sentences that help give meaning to this sources, and it's like, this is why I'm using it, all right, because this is what it means. Those are great sentences to have, and it also helps eliminate the whole drive-by quoting problem. And then we have a big summary from this article, Another Way to Close the Barn Door for Farm Tilapia. So the summary of this source basically says there are rarely no harm guards put up to protect both the livestock fish and the curious and innocent predators, which do exist thanks to technology. So this summary basically took all of those detailed like sonar pulses and everything else that didn't quite make sense. We don't need to know what all those specific technologies are. That's not really important or helpful. But the fact that there is technology that could be used and isn't being used, that's the problem. That's the main idea that I need to take from this article, not exactly the listing of what the technology is. Okay, so what has happened overall in this paragraph is that I am, one, specifically picking what I'm going to quote and what I'm going to paraphrase, depending on how they're wording it and how that wording promotes my overall argument. Second, I'm using sentences to link logically the information that I'm getting from my sources. Okay, so this whole idea of like the fish farming and the problems with regulations for fish farming, being a major supporter for why we need to update things, right? This is our supporting detail, and we are going into detail with this detail. And because it's a very complicated sort of thing, because, you know, we have the idea of a fish farm and how to protect it from predators and, you know, all these different details are going on in here, we have to kind of walk the reader through what these things mean and how they go. Okay? All right. So overall guidelines for using sources. Most of your paragraphs are not going to be quite that complicated, by the way. That is sort of like an extreme example, but if you can get through that, you can get through anything. Overall guidelines. When you're using sources, proof. If you make a claim, you got to back it up. If you say that there are 400 million bees in this area, then you got to let us know where that information came from. If you say that there aren't regulations on fish farms, then you got to let us know where you got that information. If you use a source, cite it in parentheses. Do not use attribution instead of a citation. Minimize. Quote only what is necessary. Just because they had a huge long sentence doesn't mean that you have to use the entire sentence, as long as splitting up the sentence doesn't change it contextually. And don't put in great big huge block quotes when you could summarize it down to very little and get the same idea. Connect. Give context or meaning to and between sourced information. So those are those chunks of black in the previous paragraph. Like, show us in what context this farm fishing is a problem. And it's a problem in the context of we haven't updated the regulations on these things, and it's not protecting endangered species. Okay. We also give context in between source information. This is how we avoid those drive-by quotes. We're letting the reader know why we are including this information. What does it mean? And notice that we weren't saying, I am using this quote because, right? That's self-narration. Don't do it. All right. Just give us the idea. And then also, when you're using sources, do it once. Don't repeat information with multiple sources. So if we had 5 different sources that all talked about like farm fishing is not regulated correctly, we're not going to put all 5 in there and just repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat, because A, that's boring, and B, we don't need to do that. The only time that you would ever need to have an exception to this is when you're trying to do a multiple source support of one claim. And this is especially important if you have a claim that's highly controversial. All right, so if you have like many different sources all saying that something is true, like let's say there are 3 different scientific experiments that all came to the same conclusion, then you could do a multiple source support, which basically is you're summarizing the results of these 3 scientific experiments. X is true. And then at the end, you would cite all 3 of those sources with a semicolon in between each source. So in this case, it's Lee et al. So Lee and more than 2 other authors, Goldberg, and then Breakship and Grethan. Okay? That is the only time that you're really going to have like multiple sources saying the same thing, but it's also just multiple sources in one citation. It's not the same sentence over and over and over and over and over. Okay?